Hey everybody, make sure this is on here. Um, Looks like it's on. Um, in this podcast or set of podcasts, I want to talk about the big losers of the Texas Revolution. And of course, the big losers are Tejanos. These folks, which I'm going to remind you, although you probably don't need reminding, had ruled Texas since the 1720s, especially San Antonio. With some help from Mexico City, but pretty much on their own because of their distance from Mexico City. These were the folks that had come into Texas. They had settled Texas when it was a very, very difficult place to settle. We're talking about the Navarro family. We're talking about the De Zavala family. We're talking about the Seguin family. We're talking about the Veramindi family and other Tejanos who had been in Texas by the 1820s when Anglos start coming into Texas and after the Texas Revolution. So these are the big losers in the Texas Revolution. Their story is a very sad one. It's a very tragic one. It's really more than that. Infuriating might be the right word. But the long story short is that Tejanos go from being the rulers of Texas to being what my friend Raul Ramos at the University of Houston calls the despised minority in Texas in the post-1836 period. This is one of the big points that Crisp is trying to make in his book, that up until 1836, many Anglos, especially prominent Anglos such as Sam Houston and especially Stephen F. Austin, had great admiration for Tejano families in Texas. Stephen F. Austin worked very closely with Navarro to help introduce slavery into Texas, which is not a great thing, but it just shows, again, their cooperation. Austin's brother lived with the Seguin family, so he could learn Spanish, so they're very close in that sense. Houston, although he was a pretty late arrival into Texas, also had the same kind of respect for Tejanos. This is the point of the first chapter or the second chapter of the Crisp book. And Crisp's big argument is that racism wasn't the cause of the Texas Revolution, which is what we used to think, that Anglos and Tejanos hated each other and there were racist feelings from the very beginning, when in fact there was quite a bit of cooperation between Tejanos and Anglo-Americans. Always remember how something like 9 Tejanos died in the Alamo. You had Tejanos fighting at San Jacinto under Juan Seguin. So there was really an alliance between Tejanos and Anglos even during the Texas Revolution. But it's after the Texas Revolution that the racism kicks in between Anglos and Tejanos. It doesn't happen overnight, but it happens surprisingly quickly. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. There were Anglos in Texas that always held Tejanos in contempt, even during the Mexican period. Anglos were mostly Protestant. They thought Catholicism was almost a quasi-pagan religion. It's really hard to remember the deep rifts that used to exist between Catholics and Protestants. We have so many rifts in today's society. The Catholic and Protestant one doesn't seem like such a big deal at all, but it used to be pretty major. Somewhat like if you know the Arab world, the Muslim world, between the Sunni and the Shia, where both Protestants and Catholics did believe in Jesus Christ. They had very different ways of interpreting his life, and in the Bible there were wars in Europe between Catholics and Protestants, etc., etc., etc. So Protestant Americans coming into Texas, for the most part, despised Catholicism. They despised the Spanish language. When they looked at Tejanos, they saw a darker-skinned people, and this is a period of history now where the scientists are starting to argue that the darker skin you have, the less capability you have, the more violent you are, the more childlike you are. the more cruel you are, the less intelligent you are. Um, uh, this is what we call scientific racism, and it hadn't kicked in completely by the 1830s, but the currents certainly were there. And there were many Anglos, and I would put William Barrett Travis among those, who, when they looked at Tejanos, they saw an inferior people, a racially inferior people that they despised. Um, the other thing that happens in the post 1836 period is that Anglos Americans come pouring into Texas or come into Texas. Um, there's no more laws against Americans coming into Texas, of course, because Mexico has been defeated. And so there's no more law of April 6th, 1830. Aren't you glad you're past that? Anyway, so Anglos can come into Texas, and if they can afford it, they're bringing their slaves. For slaves, this was horrific, and I'm going to talk about slavery in detail over the next couple of weeks. But many slaves, Texas was the end of the line for them. It was not where slaves wanted to be. When you're thinking about Anglos bringing their slaves, one of the things you really need to think about is slave separation or family separation, where slave families are being separated, children from their parents, wives from their husbands, that kind of a thing. But like I say, I'm going to talk about that in more detail in another podcast. So as Americans, Anglo Americans and their slaves, but Anglo Americans are kind of running the show. As they come into Texas, um, they don't really distinguish, or they don't even try to distinguish, between the Tejanos that had fought for the Texas Revolution, such as Seguin, and those that didn't. And in fact, most Tejanos did what probably most of us would have done. They just laid low. They had memories of Arredondo coming into Spanish Texas and murdering, people in San Antonio and Nacogdoches. It only happened like 2 decades before. When they look at Santa Anna, they see kind of Arredondo version 2, but of course, Santa Anna was completely ineffective as a general, where Arredondo was completely effective as a general. He knew what he was doing. Santa Anna didn't as a general. Santa Anna, I'm sorry to say, was just really about Santa Anna and saving his own skin. So anyway, so most Tejanos laid low. They were neutral. They didn't want to get involved in this fight. But when Americans and even Texans that had been, with the exception of maybe Sam Houston and some other Anglos, when these Americans start coming into Texas in the post 1836 period, and they see someone who's Spanish speaking, Roman Catholic, maybe at times their skin it might be darker than the Anglo-American skin, although that's not true of every Tejano, of course. What they saw was the murderers of the Texas revolutionaries at the Alamo, the murderers of the Texas revolutionaries at Goliad. They just saw the enemy. There was also among Anglo-Texans this great fear that there was going to be two things they were afraid of. They were afraid that Tejanos were going to ally themselves with the Mexican government, because remember, the Mexican government is determined to recapture Texas after 1836. This is the one thing that unifies Mexico, which is a very, very fractured nation in the post-1836 period, in the 10 years of the independent Texas Republic. The idea of reconquering Texas, the reconquista of Texas. Of course, they never come close to doing it, but it's an idea that's floating out there. So Anglos, when they look at the Tejano population, which is not a large population, remember there weren't many Tejanos in Texas probably at this point, gosh, maybe 4,000, maybe even less by this point. When Anglos look at Tejanos, they see a people that they despise racially, but they also see potential traitors, a group that might work with the Mexican government to help the Mexican government reconquer Texas and bring Texas back into Mexico. Secondly, Anglos were afraid that Tejanos would ally themselves with slaves. Remember, most Tejanos, um, they supported, Tejano elites supported the introduction of slavery into Mexican Texas, but many Tejanos were anti-slavery as well. Far more Tejanos were anti-slavery as a proportion of the group than were Anglos, because Anglos were 95% pro-slavery, maybe 99% pro-slavery. Slavery. So when Anglos looked at Tejanos, they saw potentially a group that might work with slaves to escape. And this brings me to the last point of this podcast. What made slavery different in Texas is if you were a runaway slave, you didn't go north towards Canada, you went south towards Mexico. Because once you stepped foot in Mexico, you were free. Not that it was easy to get to Mexico, but there are a number of uh, want ads or slave want ads where the slave owners are saying these slaves escaped and they're heading towards Mexico. And Mexico was very, very proud that it had abolished slavery, and it actually passed laws um, uh, after 1836 and into the U.S. period when Texas became U.S. that no slave that went into Mexico could ever be returned to the United States. Mexico really, in some ways, defined itself against the United States by being a country where slavery was illegal. And Mexicans were very proud that they had abolished slavery. Um, and so, for all these reasons, there's a lot of suspicion between Anglos and Tejanos. But the big issue is what I'll talk about in the next podcast.